All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Sushrut Athavale, and today I'm going to talk about design as a developer with examples in Python. A little bit about me first. Uh, oh, give me a second. I just realized I need, okay. I am a software engineer at JFrog, and I'm a DevOps developer. And I've worked a lot with Kubernetes. I've developed apps in the DevOps sphere, and I've done a lot of backend work. And some of that work has been in Python. So that's who I am. If you want to follow me, I am at Twitter at Thesis. And this is a much better looking picture of me than I am right now because I'm in the sun in Portland. Okay, so what I am going to be talking about today is it really boils down to this fundamental thesis I have, that the disconnect between design and development of a product can often be fatal. I worked at Amazon at some point. And we were working on a front end project there using React, and one of the goals of our front end project was we were editing photos, we were making a photo editing software, and we were trying to print pictures and sell those printed pictures. We had a design team to help us out. And so the design team was to give us, the front end engineers, a design they wanted the website to look like. And we were in charge of like trying to make it look like it exactly one-to-one with what we can do in React and exactly the functionality. And they had like pieces of paper and stuff. And our goal was to make that, which is a very typical workflow. Designers give you a design, you implement the design. Because of the intricacies of the design and the limitations of our technology, we found that we were unable to do some of the design elements that were specifically requesting for. And it caused a lot of contention. It took us a lot of time to start figuring this out. And in the end, we managed to find a solution that did all the things the designers wanted, but was developed in a complete, what ended up using a completely different design. And that process took a very long time, and was pretty fatal to our project in terms of cost. So I think for that reason, if one of us as developers were able to understand the ideas behind what the design was and adapt it and develop it using the tools that we know in Python or other programming languages, then we would be able to build a better product, and that would make us better, more desirable engineers. So that's what we're going to talk about, the basics of design today and how learning design will make us a better developer. And the basics of design can easily be summarized by these 7 facets of user experience. I didn't come up with these facets. I learned them from this guy, Peter Morville. He's got his own blog under Semantic Studios, and he's written a few books. And he talks a lot about design. You'll see a lot of other people talking about design in terms of these principles. So we're going to go through each one of these today and talk about how it applies to our development. And we'll look at some examples. So let's just jump right in. The first facet of user experience is that it should be useful. This is a rather straightforward design principle. The things you make should be useful. It makes sense. Where this usually will come into play is when you are, as a developer, something I've done in the past is I've said, wow, this process is very inconvenient for me. It takes like 3 hours. I don't want to do it. So I'm going to script it and I'll spend the day scripting it. I've written Python scripts that took me 2 days to build for a task that should have taken 2 hours and that I would only do once. And so in the end, that task isn't really that useful. And it's good sometimes when you're developing something or a designer tells you to do something, just to like take a pause and say, is this a useful thing to build, or is my time more useful elsewhere? But this, so I have eye of the beholder here as an example, because usefulness of a product is really in the eye of the beholder. It is up to you to decide what is useful, and that is something that is more intrinsic. You can ask customers to see what's useful or not, but that's why it is. So this is a pretty basic user facet. The thing you should build should be useful. And this is not just at the product level, but at like an individual code level too. So if I'm building an API and I'm thinking about building an API endpoint, or I've been asked to build an API endpoint, like maybe think like, what is this API endpoint being used for? Is it really that useful? And sometimes the answer is no. And it's shocking, like, oh, building a REST API, of course you want to be able to delete this. But then turns out, no, you don't want to write a delete operation for your database. Not that I've ever done that before. Next up is usable. They both have the use keyword in it, but it's different. Useful means that it has some purpose or value, but usable means that it talks about ease of use. And this is what most people think of when it comes to the user experience. Like, wow, this is really easy to use. Apple products are really easy to use. Some examples of usable apps include Robinhood, Venmo, and Uber. And they disrupted all the industries that they were in by just simply being more usable than their competitors. Uber was a more usable taxi service. It was at the palm of your fingertips. You didn't have to, you knew the price up front. You could schedule rides, things like that. Same thing with Venmo. Peer-to-peer transactions through PayPal or just in person with cash is wildly less convenient than just saying, oh, I'm going to Venmo, I'm going to Cash App you. And then Robinhood, it made, by not having any transaction investment fees and by having it on your phone, easy to go, they disrupted the industries they're in and made some really usable apps. And all three of these apps are built with Python in some extent. So that's usable. Facet number 2. The third facet, findable. This is where we start getting into meat of design. Findable relates to how, let's see, okay. In order to make something findable, when you think about making something findable, you want the products and the devices and the information you are building or the apps you are building to be findable to the user. If something is usable, they can use it. But if something is findable, they know it's there. So a great example of this is documentation. Documentation helps things be findable. But another great example of this is using industry standards and metaphors. When you're trying to make something findable, if you're putting a button where everyone else puts that button, for example, if you're making an iPhone app and you're going to use the camera, then you're going to put the button for the camera right at the bottom center, because that's where everyone else puts that button. And users instinctively know that that's where you go to find that camera button. And so that is a metaphor industry standard you can follow. In terms of Python, if you're writing code for other developers, you probably never thought of, I used to never think about design in my development in terms of just like the code itself, but you can design your code to be easier to read and easier to use by other developers, which is really useful when you're working in a collaborative environment. And so that's why we have format and style guides like the PEP8 guide for Python, because if you're following that guide and you have that little declarative comment at the beginning of every file that says, this is what this Python file is doing, or this is what this function is doing. If you're following the camel casing formatting, and if you're doing all these style things, then your code gets really easy to search through, and it's really easy to find the things you need in your code. So really think about findability when you're building things. That's why we have REST API standards, not just because it's nice to have everything how you expect, but it's easy to be able to find the APIs you need. It's like, okay, I need to get this thing, then it's probably under this get in this specific API way. So that's making something findable. Credibility. This is the fourth design facet. This is less, so when you're making something findable, you can measure this. If you want to test to see if something is findable, you can put it in 2 different versions of your product in users, and then whoever can finish the tasks faster usually means that that product is more findable and usable. These are both testable, quantitative design metrics that you can do. When you're trying to build credibility, this is less hard to test. You can survey users. It's more qualitative. And so credibility is something that's very difficult to measure, but there are ways we know that would build and sustain credibility. And you're going to see this word a lot, metaphors and industry standards, in this presentation, because a lot of people have figured this out already in terms of design. You don't need to rebuild the wheel, you can just use it. So one of these examples is documentation. Documentation used to be something you downloaded and then read through. It could come in books. But now if you were trying to use an app and it had a documentation that you had to download to use, as opposed to just like a searchable website, then people are going to be like, there's something fishy here. Like this feels like an app that is really old and I trust it less. So that type, you can build credibility by following industry answer. Don't make a downloaded documentation. Professionalism. In presentation, messaging, minimal typos. If you have an open source repo that you're building or an open source Python project, take time, flush out that README. The better that if you have a really nice high quality README, then people are automatically going to think that your Python project, your project is credible. And you can build credibility from other people's examples. Python users have built credible apps. Try and copy what they did in that sense. Another example of credibility is if you're building an app and you want to build an API in it, for example, in Python. This is now subjective. I personally would think that someone who's built an API with a framework like Django or Flask probably has a better API than someone who has it. And that is not like me saying that as fact. That is a subjective understanding of what I think is credible in the industry. So that's it. Another thing is, don't mess around with credibility. It is very, very difficult to recoup like trust that you've built with your users. Trust is hard to build. It's easy to lose. Sometimes it's okay to sacrifice a little bit of whatever now for credibility in the future. And that's really important to know. So as a developer, sometimes it's good to think of like, hey, my product managers, my designers want me to make this change really quick, but I think we'll lose credibility with your users. And I think as a developer, we are uniquely suited to consider sorry, can we mute? I think it's Marcia. We are uniquely suited to talk about some issues that our higher ups, our colleagues don't know. One of these is security. Developers usually have a better the developers I know, so some developers, like as developers, we know intrinsically security more. We're trained in it. We have our ears to the ground for vulnerabilities and stuff, more so than a product manager, for example. Desirable. So a lot of these facets can be split up into this quantitative, qualitative type barrier. Credible, these first three, useful, usable, and findable, can all be kind of quantitatively understood, but credible and desirable are more qualitatively understood. Desirability is important. There's entire brands of products that are built off of just pure marketing alone. By making your product like seem like high class, luxurious, etc., you can be desirable. How that relates to us, as developers is we're trying to make ourselves, I see this more as a personal, I'm trying to make myself more desirable as a developer. I'm trying to make my code more desirable as a developer. As a Python developer, I can do this by writing better code, higher quality code, but also by learning Python. Python is a desirable language right now. Ignore this last line. This is for a different presentation. I had to copy paste here, but this graph will show is from a Coding Dojo report where they scrape Indeed for job postings and look at what's the most desired languages right now. And Python is up there at the highest level. When you're thinking of desirability in development, I think this is one of the least applicable to developers other than marketing yourself. if you want to make like adding desirability to a Python code is difficult. I haven't really seen any examples of it myself where one developer has made more desirable code than the other. But I see desirability more as like you're learning Python, you're making something desirable. But yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk about this one last. I'm going to skip this for now. This is the 7th user facet, valuable. This is another qualitative one where you can ask users to like, is this valuable to you? But it's kind of hard to measure with like data and like clicks and metrics and such like that. Valuable is interesting. When a designer is designing a product, they're designing it to be valuable. They want all the most valuable things to be upfront and easy to use. And so they have to decide what adds value as a designer. Why should users come to you? For Venmo, for example, or for Spotify, they're gonna have like, here's a song you can play. Here's a pay or request. Here's a transaction you can make. There's actually been some critiques of Venmo's design because it's not easy to pay a request immediately. For Uber, I want to book a ride. That's the most valuable thing. A designer chooses that. So when it comes to development, how do you decide value? The product management is deciding what is valuable, what you're going to build at a company, and what the customer wants. That's their job. So how does the developer affect value and affect what we see as value? And I think of it as a measurement of cost. If value is directly related to cost, the more costly something is, the less valuable it is because it's gonna like make less money. So as a developer, if I've been told to develop or design 2 things, then I inherently know, and I have 2 options to develop it, then I can choose I can consider those options in terms of cost, how long it's going to take, how much money it's going to take, what the resources are we're going to need. And if I am able to go back to my superiors or my colleagues or my product managers with, hey, this option B is going to be more costly, but it's going to be higher quality, and option A is less costly, then you can directly affect the value of a product. And I think it's really important to think of that when you're developing something. Instead of going for what you can do, you should also consider cost. And it's like a simple idea that has some really important consequences for how we think about design, because the design of our product directly impacts the length it takes and the cost of the product. So that's valuable. And lastly, we have accessibility. And this is why I got into design in the first place. This is my most favorite design process. I'm just really passionate about accessibility in design, and mostly because it's such a broad design facet. It can mean so many things, and it's crazy how often accessibility in coding is overlooked. Not just making websites accessible, not just making APIs accessible, or not just making our code accessible. It's insane. So there's multiple different categories. Accessibility in general means that your code or your product can be used by more people. It can be put in front of and used by an additional groups of people. And that is good. You want more people to see the product. You get more money from it. You get more fame, like glory. I don't know, whatever reason you're putting your product out there, making it more accessible is good. A fun statistic I like to say is that 20% of Americans suffer from some sort of disability, color blindness, hearing loss, etc. It could be the whole range of things. And so if you're not making your product accessible to someone with a disability, you're losing out on potentially 20% of the market. And accessibility means much more than just designing for those disabilities. One example I have here is subtitles. Subtitles were added as an accessibility feature for those who are hard of hearing. they were still able to enjoy movies, videos, TV presentation by adding subtitles. Gaming, they added subtitles to gaming so that you can still experience story and sound. But it turns out that people really like subtitles. If you do surveys of like large groups of people, you'll find that there are way more people using subtitles than who actually need them, because they're just a really good feature. Like designing for disability improved the accessibility and the usability of their product in the end. Another great example of accessibility that I like is the Xbox Accessible Gaming Controller. It's a hardware feature, and they designed it a controller that allowed people with motor disabilities to be able to use the Xbox control and play Xbox games. And they get a lot of praise for it. And anyone who plays games anywhere who needs an accessible controller will use this controller. That's a broad statement. Broad statements are usually untrue, but it's very popular, and they made a really awesome controller for designing for disability. But then another benefit of this is that this controller is really flexible. So there's a lot of robotics manufacturers out there using the accessible controller because of how versatile it is. And Microsoft just accidentally designed a great product in that sense by designing for disability. Python itself was built in order to be more accessible programming than C or C++. They wanted it to be way easier to use than traditional object-oriented programming languages. And now now it's one of the most desired programming languages out there. So accessibility is really important. When you're designing code, when you're writing code in the back end, or you're writing code in the front end, think about accessibility. Think about who is going to be using your products, and consider the possibility that whoever's looking at your code, whoever's looking at your app, could be someone who's very much unlike you, but they'd still want to use it. That's why we have style standards. So everyone, conformity helps accessibility sometimes, but it's just something to think about. So I'm running a little bit low on time here. And this is just the very basics of user design. These 7 facets you can go really in deep about them. If you look here, there's some books written by some of the people I got this from that are that go into one facet for an entire book, and so they can be really deep. And another thing about design is that, unfortunately, it is not a one-stop solution. Something that is findable, for example, may make something less useful. A great example is an airplane's cockpit is extremely useful. There's buttons everywhere. One button does one thing, and you could a trained professional can do something in an airplane's cockpit much faster than the alternative. But the buttons in an airplane cockpit aren't very findable. You have to have memorized where it is, and you'd have to be trained to do so. And so that's a design consideration you need to make when you're developing something, to say what's more important here. Designers can decide that, but as a developer, you can also have input. You can say, well, no, I don't think it's more development. And if you push back, and you can discuss, and if you do all that discussion up front, I think it'll prevent a lot of confusion and a lot of frustration down the road. But yeah, and so then that's where design gets more and more intricate. If you're more interested in design, like I said, here's some books written by Peter Morville, who I got these 7 facets of user design from. These books are good. You can read the original blog post itself, User Experience Design. It's very short, but it goes into things pretty succinctly. And then my favorite book, and this doesn't relate, this isn't a coding book, is the Design of Everyday Things. And it is a book about just like everyday things. Like, why do we have a teapot, and why is the spout on one side and the handle on the other? Could you have the handle here and the spout pointing in the same direction? You could, but then you'd burn your arm. And he talks about a lot of the things that are designed today, how they were previously designed, some mistakes made in design, and it's really just a fascinating read. But yeah, that is the 7 facets of user design. Hopefully you've learned how to become a developer. And if anyone has any questions, please let me know. I see the chat has some stuff in it. So